Hello, everyone, and welcome to the PBD Essex Museum. And thank you for joining us this afternoon for another special PEM Reads event. This program, this program features author Nick Nugent in conversations about his new book, The Spice Ports, with PEM's Director of Learning and Community Engagement, David Schneider. We will take audience questions following the conversation, and we'll have a reception and book signing opportunity immediately following the program in Morse Alcove right outside the auditorium. In case of emergencies, you will find the emergency exits to the left of the stage at the bottom of the stairs, as well as at the back of the auditorium where you came in. The left-hand doors will lead you through the part of the basement will take you out to Charter Street. If you're towards the back of the auditorium, head to our main atrium and use either the front entrance to Essex Street or the south spine exit to Charter Street. Thank you so much. We hope you enjoy the program.
Hello, good afternoon. Good afternoon. It's great to see such a big crowd to talk about a new book about amazing history. So, as Muna said, I'm David Snyder. I'm the Director of Learning and Community Engagement. I'm so thrilled to have you all here. We've been doing these live author events all year and we'll continue them later in 2025. In terms of PEM Reads, our next event is on Wednesday evening on Zoom. You can still sign up for that on our website. It's our third session about Moby Dick. If you don't know this yet, we're doing a Moby Dick readathon across the year. Because if you're like me, I'd never read Moby Dick before. And so we have this great exhibit, Draw Me Ishmael. And I said to Dan Lipkin, the director of the Phillips Library, hey, maybe we should read Moby Dick, but read it over the course of a year so it's easily digestible. So each time on Zoom at 6:30 on Wednesday evenings, we get together. Dan does a master class basically in that section of Moby Dick and how it relates to the exhibit. And I ask all kinds of questions and we do breakout sessions with everyone that attends about the book. And so it's a lot of fun. So join us for that if you can. There's another one in March, and then the last one is in June. And the folks who have done the whole readathon get a special prize at the end of the year. So it's our little celebration of like, yeah, we did Moby Dick together over the course of a year. So it's super fun. So we'll be doing more of those online next year as well. So I just wanted to, again, thank you all for being here and say you're in for a real treat with this gorgeous book that Nick has created. We're going to talk about it. We're going to talk about his career a little bit as a writer. We're going to talk about the themes in the book for the first 10 or 12 minutes, and then we're going to go into imagery that Nick has brought from the book, because a big part of this book is the amazing imagery that's included in this. And so we'll talk through some of those images, and then we will do a Q&A, as Muna said, for the last 10 minutes, and then we will invite you all to join us for a reception afterwards in the alcove just outside, where Nick will be signing books and we'll be selling books. So you get a rare opportunity not only to get it, but also have a signed copy from Nick Nugent. So just to say a little bit more about Nick. So Nick Nugent was born and lives in the UK. He flew in on Friday. He graduated from Cambridge University with a degree in law before becoming a journalist and working for much of his career with the BBC World Service, where he specialized in reporting from and broadcasting to various parts of Asia. Earlier, he worked as a volunteer, as a teacher in India, and subsequently as a liaison officer for the United Nations Children's Fund, UNICEF, in eastern Indonesia, where he learned to speak the Indonesian language. His parish included the fabled Spice Islands, where he came across the story of how European powers competed with one another to trade exotic spices, including cloves, nutmeg, and mace. The Spice Ports, this book, puts that story into a wider context, with ports involved in the spice trade in Europe, Asia, Africa, and America. Among other books he has written are a biography of the former Indian Prime Minister, Rajiv Gandhi, son of a dynasty, and Vietnam, the Second Revolution, an exploration of the country after the war. He's a member of the Royal Institute of International Affairs, Chatham House in London. A little bit more about the book. So the Spice Ports is not just about history and geography. Each port-based chapter provides a context for cultural learning in literature, architecture, and science. We explore the science of Copernicus and Galileo, trace the botanical studies of Darwin, Wallace, Rumphius, and d'Horta, following the pioneering voyages of Vasco da Gama and Ferdinand Magellan, and map-making of Ptolemy and Linschoten, among others. Also more fascinating developments like word origins, naval technology, and early economic concepts, and the whole intertwining breadth of the history of ideas. Finally, I just wanted to share a little review from Amazon of someone who bought the book. I bought the Spice Ports as a Christmas present for myself and have thoroughly enjoyed every moment of it. Nicholas Nugent's extensive research and captivating writing transported me to a different world, bringing the history and allure of the spice trade vividly to life. exploring the maps included in the book with friends and family, added as an interactive and engaging element to the experience. This book is a fascinating journey through time and geography, and I highly recommend it to anyone with a passion for history, travel, or culinary adventures. So pretty good, right? Pretty good. Nick, welcome to PEM and to PEM Reads. So as we talk, if you want to grab your mic, Nick, I wanted to talk about, some of the themes that it feels like are throughout this book, themes of exploration and curiosity, economies and global marketplace, monopoly and domination, facts versus fiction, or facts sometimes bolstered with fiction, growth in technology, transportation, culture founded in ambition, and a global reflection on how our modern world was formed. But first, I wanted to talk a little bit about, how did you start? So you're a reporter in this area. How did you become a global traveler and writer? How did that all begin for you?
Well, I think you said that earlier. I was lucky enough to have the chances to work as a volunteer, first in India and then in Indonesia. And as those are two countries that are central to the story I'm telling, it follows from there that I became very Asia-focused from a very early stage. But when I returned from my volunteership in Indonesia, I joined the BBC World Service. I actually joined in the Far Eastern Service, so I was working with Far Eastern languages, Thai, Vietnamese, Indonesian, Malay, Japanese, Chinese. No, I don't know all those languages, but I know bits of some of those languages. So I was involved in the broadcasts that the BBC World Service make in those respective languages. And I graduated from that in a way to reporting from the countries. So I became very much a current affairs journalist, watching the politics and other affairs of the countries of Asia, different countries at different times, but the whole spectrum from Iran to Japan at one stage or another. So naturally, this gave me the chance to travel in the area that had become dear to my heart, and indeed dear to the story that first came to me, the spice trade story, during that volunteership in Indonesia, something like 50 years ago. So it's taken a long time in gestation or to produce the book. That's it in a nutshell.
That's great. Sarah, do you want to pull up the Google Maps I had you pull up for the Spice Islands? Because if you're like me, as I was going through this book, there's amazing imagery throughout this, and I also kept going to Google Maps to be like, where is this today? What's it called? All those things. So Spice Islands, Nick, do you want to talk a little bit about, so
Yes.
where are we with the Spice Islands?
Well, firstly, I started in Jakarta in my volunteership with UNICEF. Then I was moved to a place here called Makassar. Does Makassar ring any bells? Makassar oil? You know about Makassar oil? Do you know about this bit of kit? The anti-Macassar. I thought that might help you put things on the map, which for those who don't know the term, it used to be on the high back seat to protect the seat from Macassar oil. So that's Macassar for you. I thought I'd just demonstrate this to you. And if you haven't seen one of those before, then you haven't flown first class. Then my area of responsibility was Eastern Indonesia. It might not look like very much, but within this area there are 1,000 islands. And they include the bunch that I've called the Clove Islands, which straddle the equator around here, and the Nutmeg Islands, which are in the middle of the Banda Sea. No, you can't see them on this map. I'll show you them in a moment. But that's the geography of this, and that's where the idea first occurred to me to tell the story of how two spices that grew in 8 islands, both of them, 8 different bunches of islands, became global commodities. Because that's a fascinating story. I can't conceal my glee at wanting to tell that story.
Great. So have a seat. I'm going to have you read the piece from the introduction that you were going to read. Sarah, you can go back to the book cover if you like. So Let's go ahead and have you read that, and then we'll talk a little bit
All
more.
right, from the introduction, telling how I came to write this, the fortunes of the European nations competing for spices rose and fell according to their successes or failures in this trade. First, Venice became wealthy, giving rise to an extraordinary flowering of both art and science. Then successively, Lisbon in Portugal, Amsterdam, and London dominated the Indian Ocean and its trade, prospering as a consequence of their control over the sea routes and earning the port cities their epithets: Lisbon, Queen of the Sea; Amsterdam, the Golden; London, the warehouse of the world. Much of this advantage for Western ports came as a result of their technological innovation in compasses, shipbuilding and mapping, and enterprise in exploiting their commercial advantages. At the other end of what today we would call a supply chain, we can see how Asian ports like Goa in India, Bombay in India, Malacca in Malaysia, and Batavia, or Jakarta as we now know it, grew around the trade in spices. Initially, the trade to China and the Arab world, and subsequently to Europe, where strong demand gave impetus to seaborne trade generally.
Great. There are so many moments in here where you highlight how a spice becomes in vogue or is discovered to have value, and then a race commences about who's going to dominate it, who's going to have the market, who's going to grow that global market. Can you identify when that whole practice started? Like, what was the early moment of going, what was the spice, or what was the earliest nation that said, we've got this, we're going to monopolize this?
Well, I can only speak for Europe because I don't know the sort of depth of Chinese or indeed Arab trade with these spices. But what is apparent is that by the 15th century, when, bear in mind, Europe hadn't discovered the rest of the world, they hadn't discovered Asia or the Americas. So in the 15th century Europe, food was pretty bland, I would imagine, and drink even more so. So anything that could spice up drink and food was attractive and had some demand. And I can isolate, I don't know if I'm valid in doing that, the trade as having begun by the Venetians because they dominated the Mediterranean. Now, when you don't have a shipping route to Asia, what do? You ship from the Eastern Mediterranean, and somebody else is bringing these goods across the Indian Ocean to the ports in what we now know as Egypt, the Indian Ocean or Red Sea ports. So I date this back to the Venetians having kicked the whole process off.
Got it. There's so many times in the book, too, where you highlight the enslavement of peoples, the conquering of cultures was one of the keys of all this. And there are moments where that breaks apart and suddenly there's an ability to free ourselves of that. Can you talk about how that may have affected things and how maybe that started to break down ultimately, the practice of being able to just come in and dominate dominion? If it was the warring between major powers that loosened that, or how that evolved?
Yes, I have tried not to write a history of colonization, but of course that is central to what was going on. As I see it, initially it was trade, especially in the Mediterranean, but you mentioned slavery. Who rowed the boats that the Venetians built? They were slaves, but probably in a sort of light-hearted way, if I can ever call slavery that, because they were glad to have a job and be fed. I'm not at any stage justifying slavery, but you have to understand slavery took different forms and is central to the story I'm telling. Then trade, when the Europeans became greedy, led into colonization. Oh, actually, we're going to decide what to grow and where to grow it, because our customers in Europe, or rather we make lots of profit by growing these spices in a certain area, especially if we get monopoly control over their access to Europe. So the three things go hand in hand: trade, colonization, and slavery to some extent, which took, as I said, different forms in different places. But this story wouldn't be there if it wasn't for both those, what we now regard as very negative aspects, colonization and slavery.
I appreciated that you highlight that throughout the book before telling about what happened in certain countries or nations or islands, as a sense of this book also sort of gives us the layers of that, of the harm that was done through this practice as well.
Indeed, indeed. But I mean, I've spent a lot of my subsequent career in India especially, but Indonesia as well. And I'm often involved in a debate about whether colonization was good or bad. There are two sides to everything, and probably most people in these countries would say they benefited themselves from having been ruled by another country for a while. But there are plenty of arguments the other way as well.
Right. Monopoly also, it struck me, from a contemporary perspective, feeling like monopoly is a bad thing, and seeing early on that was quite the directive, right? The economic directive was monopoly was the way to go or the thing to do.
Monopoly equals profit. It was as straightforward as that. And the two main trading companies that I've featured, the VOC of the Netherlands and the East India Company of England, both thrived if they could monopolize, either monopolize the area of growth or monopolize the trading process or monopolize the market. If you bring it to your country, you're the only person bringing it, you can obviously charge quite a markup. Now, I'm using terminology in very 21st century way. Perhaps, as far as I know, the word monopoly was not applied in those stages, but it was. It was about monopolization, and in particular, the Dutch knew that they had collared the trade in these 2 or 3 spices, clove, nutmeg, and mace, because it only grew in a small number of islands. So hence you had a very limited supply. And if you controlled all the islands, you controlled the trade and you brought in the profit.
Right. It struck me too, because this book reflects so much on like the beginnings of globalization, right? And what globalization, how it formed. And we talk about that a lot now in the 21st century, globalization. But I think that there's sort of inherent in the talk today about, is that more equitable because we're globalized? And I wonder about the bare knuckle honesty of these eras where it's like we're going to monopolize. And now today, is it more honest, or is it just buried the way the market works in terms of power and domination back and forth?
I don't think people thought in those terms in those days. Small-scale boating ventures, they worked for themselves. Nobody talked about dominating things. I think that's too big a concept. But if you want to put this into 21st century terms, if you want to accept the thesis that early intercontinental sea trade began with spices and led to what we have today, containerization and vast shipping, vast ships for all sorts of things. Have a look at the image in the maritime room here, where you see flashed up where the ships are at any one moment. It's phenomenal, the amount of trade over the sea that takes place today. My mind absolutely boggles at how early trade in spices and other goods, let's not forget tea, coffee, cotton, hemp, rubber, I mean, all sorts of other things. But I think it began with spices, and now it is global shipping, which is enormous, absolutely enormous.
Yeah, and I think you allude at one point in the book to the opium trade too, and in our Asian export gallery, there's a installation about the harms of the opium trade, and that one of the things of drugs and effects that rode this system that had been built for spices.
Yes. Well, you know about tea and the famous Boston Tea Party. How did the English East India Company get the tea? They traded opium from India to China and brought Chinese tea, because tea started in China, let's not forget. The tea you got came from China because the English East India Company had traded opium from India to China. Complex.
Yeah. I love too how you highlight in here how, for me, things that I might assume, like, okay, noodles from Italy. No, not from Italy, from China. that got to Italy, right? Or rice in Spain. Oh, rice from China got to Spain. Oranges from China. The red pepper in India from Mexico via the Portuguese. The tulips in Amsterdam from Turkey. Coffee's real origins. It's fascinating to me, and I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that, about literally that's how it feels like you read this book and go, oh, the modern era is kind of defined or redefined by this trade.
My best example is rubber, which I feature in the final chapter of the book. Rubber is indigenous to the Amazon. So how come it's all shipped in from Southeast Asia these days? Shipped into New England, as it happens. That's where the rubber industry took off in the United States. The answer to how it shifted from the Amazon to Southeast Asia is in two places. It came to Kew Gardens. It was transplanted at Kew Gardens in London, near London, and cultivated there, and then shipped out to Singapore and planted in the Singapore Botanical Gardens. And from there it took off, and Malaysia, the Malay Peninsula, was covered with rubber trees. And then when the Americans, I forget the name of the rubber company, got involved, they planted Sumatra with rubber trees. And then the French planted French Indochina, as it was, Vietnam, Cambodia, with rubber trees. So I think that's a sort of classic example of how something indigenous to one part of the world has subsequently become very, very big in another part of the world, which on a smaller scale is the spice story as well. So, but as you say, tea, coffee, cotton, they've all been transplanted from their original natural home. And I can envisage that if we lived however many millennia ago, you wouldn't have the range, the access to the range of natural products, especially plants, that you do today, because they would all be specific to particular regions of the world. Now we assume that everything can grow everywhere, more or less.
And for me in this moment of like, we're all sort of grappling with like, what is the truth? What's our definition of truth? This is a moment in the modern era too of like truth getting a little detached, because it's like, well, this is actually from here, but now we're redefining it as over here. Yes. And so this moment of like, there's no there in terms of going like, what is the actual origin of understanding our history?
Well, people think the chili, the spicy chili, is indigenous to India. It's not. It came from Americas, it came from Mexico area. But chili is the spice you associate with India these days.
Yeah. Sarah, we can go ahead and go to our first image. And I should have said, and Nick's already demonstrated, he brought props today too, so you may get some prop demonstration as we go through. But we're going to go through about 10 images and talk a little bit about each one, what it's showing, why it's important. And we will get to Salem, which is also featured in the book. So we'll talk about Salem and the pepper trade, certainly, for Salem's history.
Okay, the spices I'm most interested in this book, but not exclusively, this is the clove, and this is the nutmeg, and the coating on the outside of the nutmeg is mace. So mace and nutmeg come from the same plant. Cloves is a different plant. I think we've got a picture. No, we haven't got a picture of the bright red. Anyway, let's move on to the next picture. Remind me. There we are. You may be familiar with seeing them in your kitchen or someone else's kitchen. Don't see it so often these days, but there they are naturally. And if you really don't know what pepper looks like, there you are. I've got the jar. You can have a look afterwards. And cloves. And the nutmeg. My favorite. I haven't got the mace because it's quite hard to get it in its natural color, which is bright red. You can get it ground, of course. So that's the introduction to the main spices, but cinnamon and ginger are also involved in the story as well.
I will say my life paralleled this book, Nick, recently, because my daughter and I are living here in Salem while my family still moves from upstate New York, because I just relocated in February. So I'm her main chef. And my daughter, Della, who's 14, recently was like, Dad, get some spices. We need more flavor to this food. So I just went and bought about 20 spices because my daughter was demanding better cooking from her father. So we now have a counter of spices, and I thought, thank God this is all available now at the regular grocery.
So should I be saying every good kitchen should be equipped at least with this range?
Right, exactly, right. Okay, next one.
Okay, this in the mid-15th century shows you a European understanding of the world as it was known. And the significant thing here is that the Indian Ocean is entirely surrounded by land. So how could Vasco da Gama in the 1490s have sailed from Portugal to India if the Indian Ocean was enclosed like that? No Suez Canal, of course. So that's the sort of mapping that the early pioneer long-distance sailors had to cope with. Next. And this is taken from the exhibit on the third floor here, the Flemish exhibit. One of the very early mapping pioneers, Abraham Artelius, made this map. In fact, he was the pioneer of the atlas, and this is his map of the world. I just wanted to show you the perspective. Now, I needn't show you where you are, but I don't think you'd find any name there that you recognize today. And destination for Salem sailors was Sumatra here. And the journey through the Atlantic Ocean as we now know it, and then the Indian Ocean, could take many months, even a year or more. And the whole journey there and back was 26,000 miles. Just imagine sailing on a small vessel, 100 tons or so, across those two great oceans. It must have been a pretty big incentive, commercial incentive, what they got to bring back from there. And the spices that they found in Sumatra, the peppercorn was indigenous to Sumatra, but the others were off the map here, and the Salem traders traded them in Sumatra and Java here, which was the first European settlements. But the Salem traders came up to the north of Sumatra, out of the reach of the Dutch, because here colonialization comes. American sailors, Salem sailors had no plans, no conquest plans. They just wanted to trade, pure and simple. But the Dutch wanted to keep them out. So they were on the northern part of Sumatra, out of the reach of the Dutch.
Just a note, Nick, as you're talking about the arduousness of these journeys, in the chapter about Lisbon, you talk about how in 1499, da Gama returns to Portugal after a disastrous journey home, but at least they brought pepper.
Yes.
At least they had pepper with them. They accomplished something, right? And then the sense of, whenever you talk about Malacca in chapter 5, in 1519, Magellan sails, sponsored by Spain, to find a journey west to the Spice Islands. He dies on the journey on the island of Mactan off the coast of Cebu, if I'm saying that right.
Yep,
His men find the Spice Islands. 18 of the 37 make it home. So this sense of really people dying for this journey.
Next slide, please. And this is how complicated it was. That is Southeast Asia as it was known. So here's Sumatra, which I just showed you on the bigger map. Here's Java, which doesn't look at all like that. This is why I love old maps. They're so inaccurate. You couldn't possibly use them today to get anywhere. You'd be hopelessly lost. So the spices themselves came from the Moluccas. The nutmeg and mace came from islands around there, below Ambon. And the clove came from islands here, actually on the equator. So once you got to Sumatra, you were closer to the spice gardens, but you still didn't know how to weave your way through these islands to get there.
I'll just say too, like when I mentioned before about the fusion of facts and fiction and what's fun, one of the things fun about these maps, like you were pointing out earlier, that sense of what they knew, what they didn't know, and that mix of like imagination and fiction in some ways also sort of mapping the way forward before you could really say, this is really what it is.
Perhaps before we leave that slide, I'll just introduce you to two things, unrelated in a way to the story, but Java, Indonesia, you may know the art form of batik. And if you're wondering about the binding on the book and my tie, this is based on Indonesian batik, which is a very particular art form. So one of the things Europeans discovered when they were in there. And Malacca, which of course is another of my ports, it's somewhere around here. Malacca is where we first came across sugar made from the palm, mainly the coconut palm, and it's delicious. So if you like natural sugar, this is an experience. And gula means sugar, Malacca sugar. And they make a lovely dessert out of it in Malaysia today. So introducing you to a few more goodies from the area.
Great, next one, Sarah.
These are...
Just a reminder to speak in the mic, Nick, just because we have
Sorry.
recording.
Yes. These are the Nutmeg Islands, or the Nutmeg and Mace Islands, if you prefer. That's all there is. It's as small as you can imagine. In the days we're talking about, the population can't have been much more than 2,500 people. It was rather more when I went there. I went there back in the 1970s. You can see the volcano. That's perhaps a clue that the volcanic soil is what helped the nutmeg tree grow. And these are the plantations on the big island here. And I want to draw your attention to one other island, this one, Pulau Run. I'll tell you a bit more about that in a moment. Okay. Remind me.
Okay.
You've seen the 8 islands, Pulau Run, very, very significant. Okay, let's see the next slide. Now, the story, as I tell it, began in Venice, as I've said, and it's a lovely image. By the way, most of these images are my own, because I collect antique maps, and this is one of my favorites. 2 things to tell you about this. Firstly, it looks like an aerial view, doesn't it? Well, it was created in the 1590s, if I remember correctly, long before man had even invented the balloon. So how could you imagine the view from the air, which we take for granted with Google Maps and everything today, don't we? But how did maps exist before you could rise into the air and see things? So that's the first remarkable thing about this map by mapmakers Braun and Hogenberg from Germany, and I have several of their maps in my collection. The second thing I want to tell you is here. This is the Arsenale, or arsenal, where Venetian ships were built. And you can still see it today. They're not building ships anymore. It's the Venetian Maritime Museum occupies this area. But obviously, the docks are still there. So that, in my view, is the origin of Venetian shipping expertise. It was created here on the east end of the island of Venice in the Arsenale. Okay, next slide, please.
Just to give you a sense, too, of the beauty of the book. That's that image as it's laid out in the book. So even just a gorgeous collection of the imagery that Nick's collected over the years is part of the value of the book.
Now, Venice also popularized the telescope.
You can zoom in a little bit, Sarah.
It was actually invented in the Netherlands, as we now know them, or Flanders. It's certainly in Northern Europe. But it was popularized for use by sailors in Venice. And here we have a very famous image in which, Galileo
leave it there.
is showing the Doge of Venice how to use the telescope. So the telescope is integral, as was the Arsenale, to Venice's success in becoming the biggest shipping nation, the biggest trading nation, probably in the world at that stage. So we've got the skill of building the ships, we've got the skill of the technology, we could call it, telescope being an early form of technology, and the maps. We've got the 3 elements that I think gave rise to the business of shipping. Okay, let's move on.
Just as we're talking about Venice, too, I just wanted to point out, you talk about how, so Da Vinci, of course, did many things, but I didn't know till this book that in 1572, he wrote the first designs for a submarine. In 1572. So another thing of like what was happening in the city of Venice way back when.
Yes.
Genius.
Good. Venice had a walk-on part. Galileo, perhaps a more significant part. Copernicus, because it was also in what we now know as Italy, that the world first accepted that the Earth moves around the sun rather than the other way round, as the popes and the Catholic Church had insisted. And Galileo very nearly was burnt at the stake for insisting on the theory that Copernicus had initiated, that the Earth and other planets go around the sun rather than the other way around. So there's a bit of scientific history associated with Venice there, with Venice and other Italian cities, I should say. So this is the earliest map of Asia by Sebastian Münster a German, and, well, look at India. It is a bit pathetic, isn't it? You've taken my point about how inaccurate early maps are. The only thing you can say with certainty is that India is between the river Indus here and the river Ganges there. But nowadays, it would be jutting right out here. Taprabana is Sumatra. Actually, Taprabana is more usually associated with Sri Lanka or Ceylon, but they didn't really know about that. So very, very inaccurate. Here's Malacca, one of the chapters I've mentioned. Here's Java. We don't even have the Java ports. And here are the spices, there and there. So that's the target, and I hope you enjoy the fiends and mermaids and whatever that you might meet on the way.
I was going to ask you, given we're reading Moby Dick right now, is that a warning to people? Is that the sense of like there's monsters out there, that size fish?
Here be monsters. This was the old remark on maps. Here be monsters. Just beware.
Next one.
Okay, so that's Sumatra, the target especially for the Salem sailors, especially the northern end. But actually in here, I mean, I've got Malacca Port, which is chapter 4, I think it is. But this had taken over from southern India as the main source of peppercorn. Again, it didn't grow anywhere else, but I don't know how it migrated from India to Indonesia. It must have been some traders, but as far as I know, it wasn't European traders. Might have been. So then Sumatra became the main source of peppercorn in the world.
And just a note of like the Malacca chapter 5, you point out terms that we get from that world. Tea, run amok, from the term meng amok, paddy, and even.
Now, of course, I'm not going to tell you that tomato ketchup came from the East, but I am going to tell you that the word ketchup is of Chinese origin, and it came to us through Malaysia, through Malacca. Ketchup, ketchup. Ketchup manis, which means sweet sauce, and ketchup pedas, which means spicy sauce. That's where we got the word ketchup from. It wasn't associated with tomato either in Canton, where it started, where the word started. I'm only talking about the word origin there, but quite fun, isn't it? I mean, ketchup we think of as an American invention, and I'm sure it is an American invention. I don't challenge that, but the word is very definitely of Cantonese and then Malay origin.
This is the kind of thing, you get this book and then you can amaze your friends over coffee and just say, did you know that's actually... Okay, next one, Sarah.
Oh, well, I couldn't resist because this is such a lovely picture. Do you recognize where that is? It's London. It's Westminster Bridge in London, a very early image. As it happened, I bought that image in New York, so it's quite nice to be bringing it back to you in a way. It's only as if to tell you that the fourth European port, first was Venice, second was Lisbon, third was Amsterdam, which I think are we going to see? I can't remember. And fourth was London. Those are the European ports that help me tell the story that I wanted to tell.
The other thing that struck me in the book too, Nick, is just the sense of, so the fire in London, the earthquake in Lisbon, natural events that wiped away this world for us too, which is part of the great detective work of this, of going, what could they support? That some natural disasters wiped away what we might see of the history.
I hope you're not drawing any conclusions from that, are you?
No, not at all. Next one.
All right, a little closer to
Can
home.
you zoom in a little bit, Sarah?
New Amsterdam. Do you recognize this picture? It's quite a well-known image. It actually comes on the bottom of a bigger map. Well, I promised I'd tell you that little story about that small island, remember? Pulau Rune.
That's good.
In the mid-17th century, 1650s, 1660s, there was massive rivalry between the Dutch and the British, or English, I should say, not least for access to the spices. And in the Nutmeg Islands, the Dutch had control of all except one of those islands, Pulau Rune. The one I pointed out to you was in the hands of the English. So monopoly breached. The English were shipping nutmeg to Europe, much to the annoyance of the Dutch. and they reached an accord in the 1660s to swap a bit of territory to help the Dutch preserve their monopoly. So the English, in effect, surrendered Pularoon to the Dutch so that the spice monopoly was preserved. What did the English get in return? You've guessed. Manhattan. So who got the best of that deal?
Yeah, whoops.
That coincided, the deal was done in the Treaty of Breda in 1667. It coincided with the transfer of New York from the Dutch to the English. So were it not for that little bit of history, you might all be speaking Dutch. I don't know if that's a fair comment, but you've got the point. You've got the point. There were other factors involved, of course. It wasn't a straight swap. But 1667 was the year when, by treaty, the Dutch held on to what they regarded as their possessions, and the English held on to what they aspired to control, including Manhattan and indeed upstate New York as well.
Nick, you'd said before we jump from this, what is that gallows-looking thing on the coast?
The books tell you that that was essentially for unloading ships, but it was occasionally used as a gallows. I mean, to me, it looks very definitely a gallows. But given how you unloaded ships in those days, I think either story is valid. But or possibly this was the gallows, I don't know. But that looks very gallows-like to me. But we're told that that is essentially for unloading the ships. Of course, you can see the Dutch influence, can't you? We associate windmills with the Dutch.
Got it. Next one, Sarah.
Now, even closer to home, do you know where this is? Right here in Salem. This is a very, very early image by a particular system of artwork, which I'd have to look up, I can't tell you offhand, but that is Salem Harbor, as was, or at least one of the wharfs. I don't quite know which one. Those of you who live here may know better than I do. But this brings the story to Salem, because as I've already given away, it was Salem seamen that decided to compete against the Europeans in bringing spices, but in this case, obviously bringing spices to America, bringing spices to Salem. And that's where spices first came into the Americas. Let's move on, because we have this lovely image from here, from the Peabody Essex Museum in the Maritime Hall, this lovely image of the Crown and Shields Wharf, one of the three big wharfs in Salem. Historical. This really was the origin, I don't think I'm overstating the case to say the origin of long-distance American trading lies in Salem. And 2 decades after independence, the Customs House in Salem, which was built in 1789, was bringing in 10% of all government revenue through trade. Massive. Salem was absolutely massive. It was the 6th largest port in America at one stage, beaten only by Boston. But Salem is much older than Boston as a trading port. And it was only when the ships needed deeper berths, bigger berths, that Salem lost out and Boston took over. Who remembers Salem as a shipping area now? I must promote the famous writer who put Salem on the map and whose books you cannot find in Salem. Here's one of them. James Duncan Phillips. Has anyone read anything by James Duncan Phillips? There are 4 books he wrote, and this is one of them. And if you want to understand Salem's very, very distinguished maritime history, read the works of James Duncan Phillips, if you can possibly get hold of them. Because I'm sorry to say, I go into the shops in Salem, and the only books on Salem history I can find are about witches. So
that's the era we're in. Some days people will say they did that.
Dig there. But this is where Salem's maritime history is told.
Great. Next one, Sarah. Okay, I think this is our last one.
Oh yes, well this I pinched. You may have seen it.
This is not in the book.
It's not. It's
nearby.
down on the Derby Wharf. It's there today, and the reason I put that up is if you look at the numbers, everything in the ship, you'll find all those things I've mentioned. So tea, coffee, cinnamon, nutmeg, peppercorn, hemp, one or two other things, I can't remember. They were all carried in these vessels from Sumatra or Java all the way to Salem. So some of those probably entered America for the first time through Salem. If you haven't been down to Derby Wharf and you're interested in the story, do go and take a look at that.
Good. I think we're the next one. Yep. So now we'll get a moment of your questions. So if anyone has any immediate questions, please raise your hand. Muna will come around to you. I think we have one right over here, one right over here. While we're doing that, Nick, I just wanted to ask you too, like this process, like how did you begin this book and how long did it take to pull all this together?
Well, I told you that the idea was formed when I lived out that way in the 1970s. And the book research began in earnest when I left full-time employment with the BBC 25 years ago, let's put it like that. I became a freelance, so I had plenty of spare time, and I researched this. A lot of it was in the British Library, and really through a lot of historic books, historic works, not least James Duncan Phillips, who I'll give another plug to now. But that's chapter 11. Chapter 11 is about New York and Salem. But of course, all the other chapters I had to find sources for.
Got it. So you got 25 years of a world-class reporter's work in the book too. Right there first.
Okay, it was a little bit out of what you said you were going to talk about in the book, but do you cover the classic era trade down the Red Sea to the coast of India for pepper and down the coast of Africa for frankincense?
Yes, I featured that. I mean, to a degree, in chapter 2, Alexandria, and then in chapter 3, with Vasco da Gama going to India, frankincense gets a look in. Just as the Venetians were trading with places like Alexandria and Tyre in current-day Syria, we had to think about how the spices arrived in the Red Sea ports of Berenice and Myos Homos, I think, is Oyster Bay. It's all there in one of those chapters, essentially chapter 2. But I didn't want to get too far off the spice story because I regard that as central to everything else. But as I've indicated, I wanted to bring in tea, I wanted to bring in coffee, and briefly rubber, and a few other things that crop up. So there's quite a lot of issues. I brought my cotton reel just to remind me that cotton was one of the goods that was brought from India to Salem.
And a follow-up, is cloves still only come from those islands, or do they now come from other places?
The answer to both questions is yes. Cloves still come from there, but now people get their cloves from the West Indies, Grenada, Caribbean, or Zanzibar is most associated with cloves, and probably many other places as well. But there is still a lively clove trade from the Clove Islands. And I'm going to give you a little guessing game at the end,
your game.
about current use of cloves.
Okay, got it. There was another hand there and then there, I think. Sorry. One of the things I said to Nick too is this, in this moment we're in too, is figuring out like, well, what is actually taken from specific places now and what is created in the laboratory, right? Like what are echoes of that flavor and what is the real thing? Yeah.
Could you talk about the various ways the different spices were protected from spoilage? Were they transported as plants, or were they ground? Were they kept in barrels or glasses? I mean, you're talking about a months-long voyage through seawater.
Well, I think one of the merits of spices is that they do last a long time. They are either deliberately dried or naturally dried so they can be shipped. Unlike fruit or fresh vegetables, spices have a long life, as we know today. That's all I can say. There was nothing scientific about how they were shipped, just shipped along with everything else. But I think they had more worries about the foodstuffs needed for the crew themselves to keep the vessel going for many months between calls at land. And by the way, I've mentioned a few of the intermediate ports like Mauritius, like Cape Town, like St. Helena in the Atlantic, all come into the story because the fact that you cannot travel for months on end without resupplying, restocking your foodstuffs. But spices was different. They were dry, and I think they were considered as good on arrival as they had been then when they were picked. That's my understanding.
Another question right here. Yes, ma'am. Right in the front. Luna.
This may be a little provocative, but the town of Salem is evaluating their logo, depicting a early trader, merchant, to a Sumatran trader. And some people think it's an accurate description of how Sumatrans dressed and how colonial traders dressed. And other people think that it is a what's the right word? A cliche of an Asian person. So there's been a committee organized to figure out what the logo means, says, and if it's derogatory to Asian, Indian, island people. And I was wondering your perspective or analysis, if you've seen the logo, which I'm sure you have, but what your thoughts were on that subject.
Well, I don't think I haven't seen it, and I don't think I've got an opinion. I just wish personally, and don't take offense, that Salem was a bit more about spices and not just only about witches. Because, okay, maybe... Oh.
Margaret response.
I thought I risked being provocative there, but it seems you're on my side. But my understanding is that the motto of Salem is "to the furthest ports of the rich East." So if that's your motto, which I understand it to be, then you've already got that early connection built in. And I personally would hope that you would see that trade as a very positive aspect of Salem's history and indeed America's history. That's my personal view.
Great, thank you. Yeah, over here.
Yes, thank you. And I'd just like to say, commend you just now for your statement that, yes, Salem should be just as known for the spice trade and the Chinese porcelain trade as well as the Salem witch trials, because coming here when I was 14 years old with my mother really opened my eyes, because I could never put my finger on why was my mother so interested in Asian interior decorating and Asian art and porcelain that she collected at state auctions and so forth, here in Massachusetts as well. So yes, thank you for bringing that up, because that has been on my mind for years. But my question is, and this is interesting, in terms of perhaps the rarity or popularity of certain materials or spices throughout significant Asian ports and South American ports, were there major port cities in which both wealthy merchants and merchants that were a bit more modest, that were investing, perhaps bidding on depending on the popularity and, as I said, or maybe perhaps the scarcity of certain items, much in a way like the Dutch did with tulips in the 17th century?
I haven't quite got that.
I'm sorry, yes.
Association of ports with a particular spice.
Yeah.
Is that what you're saying?
Yes, a particular spice or a specific raw material. Excuse me.
Yes. I'm going to read you one quote from James Duncan Phillips, who says that, speaking of Salem again, no port in America has ever dominated the trade in a single foreign commodity or in a single part of the world so thoroughly as Salem did in pepper from Sumatra in the first 50 years of the US Republic. I don't know if that begins to answer your question, but Salem was very particularly associated with the pepper trade. And I think that means that Americans of that era think of Salem with pepper. and probably other ports with another commodity. Nowadays, it's not like that. And even I showed you the ship that brought in many, many other things. But pepper seems to be the one that captured the imagination and probably made the most profits.
And I would guess too, as ships got larger and Boston took over Salem, for example, the diversity of things coming in became greater. And so one single sort of dominance of a thing became less as the ports became larger, I would guess. Other questions? We have time for one or two more questions if we have them. So right there. One right there in the center. Yeah, if you go up there. Love it.
First, an introduction. Recently, within the past few years, it has been discovered that there is a huge port on the shore of the Red Sea, which, among other things, has a Buddhist temple. It was a major trading center and import center for the Far East, connecting it to the Mediterranean. And what arrived there went up to Cairo and the cities in Egypt and then crossed the Mediterranean. And that port goes back probably at least to Venice in the period that people have been thinking about. So it's a very old city and they've only just begun to excavate it. So are you familiar with that?
I'm not with that. When you mentioned the Buddhist Association, I don't know about that. But I certainly know about the trading by both Arab traders and Indian traders across the Indian Ocean to ports in the Red Sea. It's much about that in the second chapter, where I've depended very heavily on an anonymous book that was written in the 1st century AD, as far as I can recall. It's called The Periplus of the Erythraean Sea. And it's a wonderful, wonderful historical source.
Well, this may greatly expand, as they continue their excavations, greatly expand what we understand what was going on.
Great, thank you. We should, before we wrap up, Nick, you're gonna play a game with us, right? Do you wanna do your game? And
Yes,
I will
indeed.
just say, before we do the game as the period to this session, right afterwards, again, join us for the reception afterwards. We're selling the books right outside in the alcoves. Nick is gonna be signing the books, so join us for that. And I also wanted to thank Sue Raymond, who's here today from Brandeis University Press, who brought the book to the United States. So Sue is the reason that it's here in our country and brought this project to PEM. So thank you, Sue, very much for being here.
And can I share that, my appreciation with Sue, for Sue and the Brandeis University Press for bringing the book here. Yes, I want to ask if you know what these spices are used for these days. Now, if you come from Salem, you use it to make cider spices. That's got cinnamon, ginger, and nutmeg. Great. I don't need to tell citizens of Salem how to use those spices. But I want you to try to think of a use of clove. Let's start with clove that doesn't happen in Salem, doesn't happen in America, indeed doesn't happen in much of the world. A use for cloves that you don't know about. Gentlemen here. Clove flavor cigarettes. Congratulations. Congratulations. This is the biggest selling variety of cigarettes in Indonesia. And please take a sniff.
They smell wonderful.
It's rather delightful. So when we have a reception,
If you buy a book, you get a sniff. Let's say that. If you buy a book and get it signed, you get a sniff.
if you buy 2 books, I'll give you a cigarette.
You get 2 books, you get cigarette from Nick. Okay.
So
great.
congratulations. And you know, in answer to a previous question, Indonesia does not produce enough cloves to meet the demand for Kretek cigarettes. They're called Kretek cigarettes. So they import from Zanzibar. How strange is that? The country that gave you cloves now can't produce enough for its own consumption.
So let's do Nick, let's do the last one. Oh, wow.
Yes, well, oil of cloves. for numbing the pain. Good.
So as
Thank you, sir. You've come up with 2 key uses of clove in the 20th century. Now, what
As we
about,
wrap? Let's do your last one.
let's
Nick.
have a similar game with nutmeg. Now, my answer here, I'm suggesting to you that the major use of nutmeg in this day and age is global and particularly strong in America. Does anyone know what I'm aiming at? I'm not talking about Christmas cakes or junket or whatever.
Not pumpkin spice. Close, but not.
No one guessing? Right. Yes, I think I heard someone say it. There is believed to be nutmeg in Coca-Cola. A friend of mine, professor of nutrition in London, wrote to Coke and say, is it true that nutmeg is a key ingredient of Coca-Cola? And of course we got the, sorry, couldn't possibly tell you, trade secret. Very few people know. But if you Google around, you will find that the popular theory is that nutmeg, and possibly cinnamon as well, are key ingredients of Coca-Cola. There you are. Both these key spices have 21st century applications. So we're not talking history, we're talking these spices in use today around the world. Thank you.
Thank you all for being here. Thank you, Nick. And join us outside, please, afterwards for a light reception. We'd love to talk with you more. Thank you for being here.